Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to It Says What, where JW3 and Limmud come together to bring you unexpected and poignant Jewish content from across the Jewish community every week before Shabbat. I am Joe Hyman, JW3's young programmer, and JW3 is the UK's Jewish Community and Art Centre. If you haven't met us, we look forward to seeing you in September when we reopen. Check out Ashley Blaker's new shows that will be on sale on our website at the moment. We are partnering to bring you this program with Limmud, a diverse and inclusive worldwide community of Jewish learning. And we're really excited to be bringing educators, artists, and leaders from across the Jewish community in the UK and abroad to share a surprising piece of Jewish wisdom for our time. You can ask your own questions in the webinar, on YouTube, or on Facebook, and we'll bring them into the conversation towards the end. I'm delighted to welcome Yael Roberts, a friend, but also an educator, community organizer, and visual artist. She lives in London and works as Director of Community and Education at Westminster Synagogue. Originally from St. Louis, Missouri, she has worked previously at Reform Judaism and Yael Synagogue, teaching Torah and building communities. She studied at the Pardes Institute, Yeshiva University, and Camberwell College of Arts. Yael especially enjoys learning and teaching Hasidic texts because of the new and creative ways that they read our traditional texts. And today, Yael will be bringing one of those texts to see what we can say about it. So welcome, Yael. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. It's really great to be here. Thanks, Joe.
I'm really excited to have you. And I'd love to hear what text you're bringing today. Where's it coming from and what's it about?
Great. So we're going to look today at the Noam Elimelech, an 18th century Hasidic master, Elimelech of Lezhinsk. And we're kind of going backwards quite a few parshiot to Parshat Bo, the section of the Torah Bo, where God commands Moses to Bo el Paro, to come to Pharaoh. And like all Hasidic texts, the Noam Elimelech, which I do have here, we're going to be reading from a source sheet, but I have one of the books. You can also get it in like a small little microscopical thing that you can look at quite small as well and carry around with you. But like all Hasidic texts, he'll be reading it a bit more creatively, perhaps, than we would usually read the text, but I think maybe more truthfully. So I'm not a big fan of Hasidic text as metaphor or as parable. I think it reads the text as it is, and I'm looking forward to learning it with you.
I'm really excited. So we've got the text up on our screen now. And Yael, would you like to lead us through this journey of this text back to Parshat Bo, but to speak to our current moment?
That sounds great. And also, Joe, feel free to chime in with questions, and I might ask you a few questions along the way.
My pleasure.
I'll just start us off with the verse from the Torah, which is Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. God says to Moshe, Bo el Paro. Bo, come, go, a bit unclear, but kind of come to Pharaoh. Ki ani hichbadati et libo ve'et lev avadav, leman shiti ototai ela bikirbo. Because, come to him, because I have hardened his heart and the heart of all his courtiers in order that I may display my signs among them. And then, Ulaman tisaper b'oznei bincha uven bincha et asher hitalalti b'mitzrayim ve'et ototai asher samti bam v'iratem ki ani Hashem. In order that you should then be able to tell the story to your children and their children. So, like all good readers of Torah, the Noam Elimelech begins by asking some questions about our verse. So he quotes our verse and he says, Hadiktuk mefurash b'zohar hakadosh, lech el paro hayal lamar. It should have said lech el paro. It should have said go to Pharaoh. Why does it say come to Pharaoh? Bo. Why not lech? God says to Avraham, lech lecha, go. Why doesn't it say the same thing here? Ve'od mazen nitinatam ki ani chbadati et libo. Adaraba me achar shechbid et libo lama lo lelech b'chinam halo bivadai lo yishamala. So why does it say go or come? Because I've hardened his heart. Surely if God has hardened Pharaoh's heart, that is not the time to go to Pharaoh. That is not the time that you're going to free the Israelites. What are you up to? What are you doing? So he's going to give his own explanation, which might be a bit different than, you might have heard maybe the conventional explanation that come to Pharaoh. Okay, God says come to Pharaoh because God is where Pharaoh is. But this is going to be a bit different, so bear with it. So he says, V'nireh lefaresh dihine birot hatzadik niflaot haboreh. Oh, kishayishama mechavero hatzadik tavarim kadoshim, azai hu mitlahev ba'avodat haboreh barach v'talah. So When a tzaddik sees the wonders of the Creator or hears from a friend sacred words of Torah or just conversation, they become kind of ecstatic in their worship of the Creator. But this does not happen with the Rasha. The Rasha, af kasher en niflaot, o shatzadik medaber elav pa'am achat, azai hu chozer lefi sha'ah. Aval einu mitkayim b'kirbo, eza zman, v'hu kekelev shav el kiyo. Aval, כשהצדיק מדבר אליו יום יום, או בראותו נפלאות הבורא, יום אחר יום, יכול להיות מתקיים בידו זמן רב. So the tzaddik can have an ecstatic experience and sustain it. The Rasha cannot. The Rasha can have an experience, and then they can just kind of return to their evil ways. So what's kind of interesting here is, in a sense, we kind of become the Rasha, perhaps, right? Like, we're the people, at least I'm one of those people who can have like a really amazing experience. I mean, think of high holidays coming up. You go to shul, you have this incredible experience of being with the community and this musical experience, and you're elevated and you make all these commitments for the new year and you're so excited about your Jewish practice. And then the next day you go back to whatever you were doing before, or maybe it's a few weeks, but it isn't sustained. That's, I think, most of us. The tzaddik is someone who can sustain it, but the Rasha can sustain it. Most of us can sustain it if we have a practice. It's practice that can hold that ecstatic experience. If you scroll down, Joe. So this is kind of like the it says what moment. I think he says, V'zehu, which is always like, I'm about to interpret the text. He says, Bo el paro b'kvi'ut yom achar yom v'lo b'derech harai. V'lachein lo ne'amar lech shehu lashon harai. So he says, lech, going, is a kind of language of temporariness. God says to Abraham, lech lecha, go. Just go. And Abraham goes, and that's it. But bo, this idea of coming, is day in and day out. It's day after day. It's not a kind of thing that you do once. Again, it's a kind of practice. And then he says, V'zehu hanatinat ta'am ki ani ichbarati v'chulei leman shitiototai ratza lomar otiotai hakdoshim shetidaber elav yom yom asim b'kirbo daika kilomar shit kaimu b'kirbo zman rav. So part of the reason God hardens Pharaoh's heart is so that Pharaoh can actually, as the Rasha in this case, hear Moshe's wisdom day after day in order for Pharaoh to be elevated, in order for Pharaoh to have a kind of spiritual practice and a moment here, and in order for Pharaoh to not just simply return to his evil ways. So God hardens Pharaoh's heart so that Moshe has to return day after day, both for Moshe's sake, but also for Pharaoh's sake. And we'll get a little bit to that in a moment. So the meaning of otot is also signs, but it's also letters. It's also this internalization of Torah, of wisdom. So we just go down. He then continues, so we already said this, that tzaddik, when they have this experience, their heart becomes elevated for a long time, not just once. So the tzaddik is someone who has a one-off experience, and can sustain it. But when they continue this practice, they can actually take it further and transmit this wisdom and this practice for generations and generations. I know we can see the English, but I can't see all of the Hebrew. Just go up. And I think it's really important also to read these texts in Hebrew to kind of get a feel for them. So I know that we also have the English as well. So for Moshe, for Pharaoh, the reasoning is so that Pharaoh can actually sustain this elevation, this, whatever we want to call it, this, we don't have to call it elevation, it doesn't have to be directional, but this kind of ecstasy. And for Moshe, the reason is so that he can heal generation after generation, so that this, that for Moshe, as already being a tzaddik, the healing can kind of be transmitted for generation after generation. So that's our text in short. I think it's quite a unique and perhaps surprising read on this pasuk. And I'm looking forward to continuing to discuss it with you, Joe, and with everyone who's joining in. It was a bit fast.
No, it was great, and I think that we can go back into it in kind of a bit more detail and have a conversation about it. But it's really beautiful and really interesting to see Pharaoh in this way. The idea of hardening the heart, people often see as something that is, a conversation about God limiting Pharaoh's free will. So just before we go into it, what do you want to say to those people kind of who are thinking about it in terms of free will? This seems like it's offering a different perspective. It's offering something that's about something that's actually in human nature, to have a hardened heart, to be unable to receive something, or kind of unable to sustain an experience.
Yeah. I don't even know if I can like speak to the free will conversation, because
it's all good.
I think like I have had so many different so much kind of learning throughout the years and conversations floating around about it. And at some point I just kind of totally tuned it out. I was like, I'm done with this free will conversation. And I think what I think is interesting is like we each have this kind of internal Pharaoh that's keeping us in Egypt, that's constraining us. I did this therapy for a while called IFS, Internal Family Systems, where we have parts of ourselves that are in dialogue with each other. And certainly Pharaoh is one of the parts that's quite hardened. But it's like dafka because Pharaoh's heart is hardened. It's dafka because, or like specifically because Pharaoh's heart is so hard and resistant that we need to go to Pharaoh every day. So it's like those places which are the most difficult and the most hard are actually the places where we need to show up for daily practice. And that can be kind of quite scary to hear, that this isn't necessarily about like getting everyone out of Egypt right now. Like collective liberation, 1, 2, 3. That'd be great. That's what we all want. But like the process along the way involves kind of reckoning with a lot of our own and each other's pharaohs, like very dark places that we like to pretend that we don't have.
So would you say that this process that happens before this, collective liberation 101, the Pesach story, it's what we hold on to as this, God took you out of Egypt. But the prelude of the slavery and the difficulty that went on before, it seems that there's a lot of lessons to learn in that space. So this is what this is coming to say, I guess.
Something about like the process along the way being as important, but also as reoccurring. Like, I don't think, Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, who's a Black queer Buddhist, like talks about this as well, that like, we don't just like achieve liberation right away. It's not like this kind of like, it's constant work and constant practice. Like we never fully arrive. If we stop working on it, like we go back into like oppressive narratives. So I think there's like a sense in which like the process is important. We leave Egypt each day, we celebrate Pesach each year, and that's because it's constant work. Doesn't just happen once.
It's really fascinating, and I think important to hear, especially in this current moment where there is so much liberation to be had and to be put into the world, and however way we can do that. But to see it as this constant, daily, persistent practice. I'd love to focus in on this like lech versus bo. There are people watching today that are like, what do you mean? Like, there's this word go and come. They're the same thing. What is that? That's like, why is he focusing on such a little detail? But you mentioned that it's lech lecha, kind of a bit similar to Abraham when he left, and Moses is kind of seen as this kind of person that says come. How do you kind of see that as a really important differentiation, actually, as opposed to just two words that could have been used, as opposed to something more meaningful?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I taught this text at Westminster Synagogue a few months ago as part of we had some learning for times of difficulty and challenge. And I asked that very question, kind of like why lech versus bo, what do these words actually mean? And I think like that's something we can all each think about for ourselves. For me, lech is a kind of running away, maybe. Like it isn't, because it's a kind of journeying, a kind of like soul journeying. Abraham goes forth and he has to do that as a kind of like initiation. Like he isn't going to become Abraham unless he goes and does that. And it's like this one-off thing, and it's a kind of like going away from the known into the unknown. And that's like great work, and it's something that we each do a few times in our life. And something that I think we were saying before, like I think as millennials sometimes we substitute that for like the bow kind of work. We're like, oh yeah, we'll just do like 10 of those kinds of pilgrimages or initiations or retreats or so on and so forth. And then like, like great, like everything's done. But I think that the bow like is a kind of it's a kind of coming closer. It's like this kind of beckoning of the soul. So it's not like this kind of like running away towards something else. It's like, what's already here? Like what's underneath me? Like one of my friends once said, I go on holiday and oh no, I brought myself. Oh no. So it's like, yeah, like what is already here? What's already showing up in our own daily lives? Like we sometimes need to do that lech, but like, what is that kind of bow, the kind of coming closer?
Yeah, no, completely. I see that. And I see that also in Moses' life story, I guess, that he had his lech moment, he left, he ran away to Midian.
Yes.
And he had that. But this is kind of like, okay, we're going to have like, Abraham 2.0 right now. We're going to have the next stage of what it looks like to develop as a person.
Absolutely.
The idea of like development as a person in the context of this story is really interesting to me. And I also noticed this Sadiq Varasha imagery in this text. And often when we see that Sadiq Varasha imagery, we think evil person and like great person. Yeah. And here you mentioned, I think people would have noticed that you mentioned the Rasha, maybe by Noam Elimelech of Lezensk, isn't seen as necessarily this evil, irredeemable human being, but actually someone more imperfect, flawed, a bit more like us. And Sadiq is kind of far above it. Is that something that Noam Elimelech does often? Is it something that is common and we have been looking at, differently for quite a long time?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially in the lead up to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where we also have this idea of the Benoni, the person who is neither tzaddik or rasha, which we say like most of us are in this Benoni category. We're,
What does Benoni mean? It's like middle.
Thank you for asking. Like kind of in between, like in the middle. Yeah, something in between, like kind of neutral. When I think the reality is, and I mean, the Noam Elimelech is really interested in this idea of the tzaddik. I'm not an expert in it, but from what I understand, definitely like later generations of Hasidic masters begin to read this idea of the tzaddik as someone who we could all be, someone who is within all of us. And I think he's here, or at least how I want to read him, is saying like, within us, we do all have this Rasha and this tzaddik. We do have the Moshe and the Pharaoh. It's not this depressing thing of, oh no, I'm just Pharaoh. I'm never going to be able to like sustain a practice. I'm never going to be able to hold on to like the amazing high holiday experience. Like it's not. We also have that Moshe within us if we do the bow. Like, and it's like the actual meeting of those two parts that could be exceedingly powerful. The same way that it's like, we can talk also about like echo chambers and like people kind of finding themselves around people that agree with them, which happens across the political spectrum, and it's just the nature of how community forms, right? But like the real powerful encounters are when people who disagree or have different moral compasses like come together and have like frank dialogue. Like we should be doing that every day. I think it's so important. Like I learn so much from people I disagree with.
100%. And I think this is asking a person to kind of step into those uncomfortable situations, whether within themselves or outside of themselves. I read recently this week's Torah portion, Ki Tate Seyu. It says, "Don't abhor Egyptians," and it's interesting how you could take this text to be like, Pharaoh is terrible. He's a rasha. He hardened his heart against the Jews. We now hate all of the people that are associated with him. But it actually kind of brings it internally. But I wonder if we could just talk, because it's important to note the difficulty of that for a lot of people with lots of trauma and lots of kind of like histories that they'll have to kind of constantly address in those moments. I wondered if you could just talk a bit about that, how you see kind of personal journeys and personal histories impacting how we, come into ourselves. Bo.
Wow. Yes. This work is really difficult, and like there's no kind of, it is a kind of command, but it's not necessarily a command that anyone on this call or in the world has to like hear right now and start doing. It's not a kind of like mitzvah necessarily, but it is an option. And I think it is quite hard given all of our own individual histories. And I don't think it's work that we can do on our own. Like Moshe tries to do it maybe more on his own than he should. Like there's a sense in which this kind of work needs to be done collectively. Like it cannot be done on one's own. It needs to be done with support and with other people who are doing it as well. And it needs to be done not on an individual level, like I'm going to heal myself at the end. Like that's not how this works. It's I'm going to heal myself as part of healing the world. Like that's my mission. I'm not healing myself to like enjoy my life and like be more mindful and like, you know, feel really good and present. I'm healing myself to heal like all of my Jewish ancestral trauma from the Holocaust and like to then reach outward and like contribute to the healing of like all people and like the universe. Like it, and that's like a big project. That's not something we can do on our own.
It seems to me that this kind of not being on your own scenario is reflected in this archetype of the Sadiq. And like what do you see in the kind of this archetype of the Sadiq, that he's able or she's able to bring that outward? It seems in this text the idea is that they can like help other generations to heal through their doing it. Is that something that's present in this text?
I think absolutely. And also this idea of the, you know, the tzaddik speaking to friends and exchanging these sacred words, definitely that's there. Absolutely, like a kind of connection for sure.
And in terms of this kind of ecstatic experience of Lech Lecha or even revelation versus this slow practice, you know, it's coming up to Rosh Hashanah, it's coming up to also kind of being the 5th, 6th month in lockdown, kind of, or some form of lockdown. Has this text been speaking to you in that way, to support your journey through this more isolated moment?
Yeah, so I guess we did talk a bit about like it being a kind of text about collectiveness and connection, but I think it can also speak to the individual. There are only a few characters in this text. It's been a really difficult few months. Like, I mean, it's been difficult for me. I'm sure everyone has had their own difficulties that range. And I know those difficulties have been all across the spectrum and board. And like, I'm not comparing how hard it's been for me to how hard it's been for anyone else, but it's been a hard moment. And like, the tendency could be to like run away or to not want to kind of be present with that. You know, that's my natural tendency. I'm like, oh, it's really difficult. Like, when is lockdown going to end? I need to get out. This is horrible. Then I'm like, oh, wait, I'm employed. Like, I have a roof over my head. I have food. I have like a family that cares about me. Like, I'm okay. Okay, so then what's so difficult? And then I can like start to work with it from a place also of like safety and like belonging.
100%, and that kind of needs to do that, as opposed to kind of being the inability to lech, to go, kind of pushes you in. I'd love to hear a bit about your artistic practice.
Yes.
Because how does this impact that, and does this relate to your artistic practice, and how do you kind of build this idea of coming back into it?
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. I mean, I think there are many days that I like wake up and don't want to go to the studio. That's like a constant thing. And I don't know, that's because like there are like a lot of demons that live there. It's like a difficult place. It's like often, you know, I make collaborative work, but I also do a lot of work by myself. And it's really facing one's own psychology in a really visceral way. Like, you know, I turn off technology. I'm just there. I'm making. I don't know what's going to come out. Like, I have a lot of judgmental voices. Is this good? Is that good? Like, would so-and-so think of that? What if so-and-so think of that? Will it get into this open call? Like, and actually, like, there's a sense in which the best work that I make, I think, comes out from going to Pharaoh, like going to those places of difficulty, like confronting those voices. I have been reading the new Jerry Saltz book. I think it's called like How to Be an Artist. And he does talk about that, like the constant voices in our heads in the studio. But in that sense, it's a practice. Like, one doesn't become an artist overnight. Like, you know, I've been making work constantly since I was like 16. Like, I can't stop. I don't have nothing in me can stop. It's like breathing. But if sometimes I don't want to go, but it is kind of that kfiyut. It's not an RI thing. You don't go on a retreat and become an artist. It's like a daily thing.
It's really an amazing insight into that process of being an artist. And I'd love to hear just more generally for the audience who may not have experienced someone who is an artist and kind of someone who is, you know, understanding and kind of engaging with Jewish texts and having that conversation between the two? Like, do Jewish texts often support your artistic journey? Do they kind of provide the roots for a lot of the thoughts that you have about the art that you create? What's that relationship like?
Oh, a great question. Something that I think about all the time. I think that there was a point where I kind of decided to not be a Jewish artist, by which I mean, like, I don't illustrate like scenes of like the Exodus. Like, I don't like paint pictures of like Moses going up to Sinai. And yeah, most of my work actually, for whatever reason, sometimes it explores Jewish themes. I made some prints about trauma from the Holocaust. Like, I've done work about like high holiday liturgy, but in general, like the way that the Jewish text kind of relates to my artistic practice is exactly like this. So it's like a sense in which the Hasidic text that I love reading and studying, it influences the way in which I do my artistic practice. Like, so everything that I read, like the text we just read, feeds into like how I am as an artist. It's less about making work about the text, but it's about the text holding the artistic practice.
That's really fascinating and really beautiful to see these images of these people that we often feel quite distant from, from a far history away from us, kind of being brought into ourselves. And even if we're not artists, I believe that we're all artists. But
we really are.
But kind of bringing that in is so fascinating. It's really interesting speaking to you about this text. I think it has so much to say to people in lockdown with their practice, and how they kind of look after themselves, but also grapple with those difficult issues inside. We've spoken a little bit about Rosh Hashanah, but do you see this text in how it relates to people's kind of Jewish connection and Jewish relationship with their Jewish identities? Like, how does that relate? It's the same thing, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we can also think about this in terms of Jewish practice and teshuvah. Like, I guess it's like that moment in the Talmud somewhere where someone does teshuvah on their deathbed, and it's like accepted that we can do teshuvah at any point. That like, even if we're finding ourselves mostly in the place of Pharaoh, like even if things are really rough, even if we don't feel connected to God at all, even if we're like enslaving our Jewish selves or whatever, like internalized anti-Semitism, whatever, like, or any kind of like oppression of our Jewish identities, like, yeah, we can still find our way out. Like, we can still do teshuvah even from the really most difficult place. I find that very inspiring.
Yeah, and I think for some people, watching today and watching this at a later date, there is that opportunity to do that this year. There aren't as many opportunities out there to engage in an ecstatic experience of community right now for Rosh Hashanah. There are plenty, but people have an option this year to maybe stay at home with their pharaohs and kind of see what happens, and see if their kind of return to themselves happens for them in a different way this year. And I'm really excited that you've shared this text with us, because I think that will support people in that process. So thank you so much, Yael. Really glad that you came on to learn with us, and really wish you the best of luck with the artistic process and with the educating over this period. Shabbat Shalom to everyone on the call today. Check out all of our events online at jw3.org.uk. We've got a huge schedule coming up over the next few months with our buildings reopening. We're still doing plenty of events online if you're not comfortable coming out just yet, but please still be part of our community, and we look forward to seeing you either on screen or in person soon. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.